Hello, and welcome to Sound Heal Podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Brown, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue to explore the fields of sound healing, sound therapy, and generally the use of sound for health and wellness. We are joined by John Stuart Reid, an acoustic physics scientist and explorer of cymatics, the field of visible sound. We explore John's background, what inspired him. He discusses sound giving birth to light, physics, the power of music medicine to affect healing, discoveries and collaborations, explorations with his invention, the cymoscope, and the scientific and spiritual aspects of sound as being a creative force in the universe. We also discuss music, sound, and the pineal gland, and how we can apply what we understand from cymatics as musicians and sound healing practitioners. What if healing wasn't just about the body, but the soul returning home to love? Imagine the sacred sounds of ancient traditions guiding you into a deeper connection, profound peace, and true lasting transformation. The University of Sufism presents Healing Sounds of the Abrahamic Faiths, a groundbreaking program exploring the mystical power of sacred sound in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Learn from renowned masters as they unveil how sacred vibrations can restore balance, elevate consciousness, and awaken the divine within. Whether you're a healer, seeker, or simply curious about the power of sound, this program offers a profound, in-depth journey into the heart of spiritual resonance. No musical experience or instruments are required, only the voice and the breath is needed. With 3 levels to choose from, you can engage at the depth that feels right for you. Whether you're looking for an introduction, practitioner training, or advanced mastery, enroll now and begin your path toward sacred sound healing. Visit sufiuniversity.org to learn more, or call 800-238-3060, extension 701 to speak with an admissions counselor. And tune into the episode in late April to hear Sufi master Layla Brady-Waltzer and award-winning composer Yuval Ron speak about their unique offering in this in-depth program. You won't want to miss it. You can find the link in the description, the show notes of this episode as well. Please enjoy this episode with John Stuart Reid. Welcome, John Stuart Reid. It is so wonderful to have you here. Thanks for saying yes and for being a part of this podcast.
It's a great pleasure, Natalie. I'm really delighted to be meeting you for the first time, and I'm sure we're going to have a really lovely conversation.
I'm really, I've been looking forward to this, and I'm sure many of the listeners know of you, have, heard of your work and maybe heard interviews or Shift Network. There's all kinds of possibilities with the audience of this podcast. But let's go ahead. You've had such an interesting career, from 30 years as an acoustic engineer to developing the cymoscope. So maybe just share a little bit about what first inspired you to dive into the study of sound, and specifically in the context of the potential of sound or vibration.
Sure, I'd love to. Well, as you said, I was an acoustics engineer, well, for 30 straight years. That was my business, as it were, and I was very much a kind of left-brained person for about 27 of those years, actually. So I was very much, even though I was an engineer, really, I was a born scientist. And when my mother asked me when I was still at school, what career path would you like to take for yourself, Johnny? I said I want to be a scientist. And actually, it was my father, who was a television engineer, who he was the guy who really inspired me to have a career in electronics, essentially, because what he was saying was, and it turned out to be absolutely spot on, correct, that if you have a really great background in electronics, then it will stand you in good stead for ultimately for a career in science. And so that's exactly what I did. So that's why initially I became an engineer. And the other thing, Natalie, about being an engineer is, well, it proved to be a really great way to earn a living. Which, when I eventually got married and had children, these are the practicalities of life. You have to be able to earn a living. And actually, science, the field of science, is more challenging in terms of making a living because it's all tied up with grants, and it's not so secure really as engineering. At least that was my thought process at the time. And anyway, so I was a left-brained engineer, you could say, for 27 of those years. And then in the late 90s, I took a class, I took a week's workshop actually with Jill Peirce, who you might know is the wife of Rupert Sheldrake. And much later, I eventually met Rupert, and he now owns a Simoscope instrument. Actually, he came here and worked with me in the lab. But going right back to when I first took that course with Jill, that really changed my life. Actually, that was life changing. She knows it, she knows what happened to me because I was sitting really close to her so I could hear every word that she said, and I was soaking it all up and writing notes, copious notes, And then we had a coffee break, and at some point, and a young woman came up to me and said, what are you doing writing all these notes? And I said, well, I'm really interested in what Jill has to say, and I don't want to miss a single thing. And she said, look, John, she said, just if you take my advice, put your notebook down and just focus on what she's saying. And she said, open your heart and just allow in whatever needs to, it needs to land there, sort of thing. And that will be a really great way forward for you. And I took her advice. I don't know who this young woman is, but anyway, I took her advice, and sure enough, that's exactly the way it worked. And in that workshop, which actually it turned out to be a rebirthing workshop. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for, Natalie. I thought it was all going to be about vocal toning, vocal overtoning, which I was really interested in at that time, again from an engineering perspective and so on. Anyway, it turned out to be a rebirthing ceremony that we went through, and that really changed my life. What it did for me, it was almost like a miracle, really, because I entered that workshop with a very left-brained approach. To my whole life, I had been that way. And then, because of what happened in that workshop, which I don't need to go into all the details now, but suffice to say that I became a whole person. This is the way I feel about it. My right brain opened up, my heart opened up, and I became, a whole person. And now, because of everything that Jill taught me, I'm this person who can move between left and right brains at will, and therefore I can understand aspects, for example, of sound therapy from a spiritual perspective and a metaphysical perspective, as well as from a purely scientific perspective. And that gives me a kind of whole picture of healing. And so I've got a lot to thank Jill for, basically. Anyway, so moving on from there, it was just after that, actually, that I conducted my experiments in the Great Pyramid. I'm sure many of your viewers and listeners will know about those, and that they were life-changing too, in different ways, of course. But one of the ways was that I had injured my lower back about 3 weeks before going out to Egypt in '97, thinking I would probably have to cancel the whole mission because I was in so much pain. You know how it is when you are in great pain, it's really difficult to think straight, actually. And I knew, having rehearsed this experiment that I wanted to conduct, which was a cymatics experiment, I knew, back in the UK that that unless I was really clear in my thinking, I wouldn't be able to conduct that experiment. So that's why I was thinking, oh, I think I'm going to have to cancel this. But I'd paid quite a bit of money to the Egyptian authorities to be able to have the permission, to carry out these experiments. Anyway, cutting it very short again, I did manage to get myself to Egypt. Other people carried the equipment. I couldn't carry anything other than my camera. And even getting into the pyramid, it was really difficult. You probably know you have to bend low. And with this back, as I later discovered through many years of study, that when you have a spinal injury, as I had, it was just picking something up at an awkward angle and basically straining muscles in my lower back. Whenever you injure your spine in any way at all, there's a wonderful mechanism that nature has evolved for us to protect and to heal, or to help heal that area of your body. And it's basically a kind of spasm that your spina erector muscles go into. All the muscles in that area spasm deeply to protect. Basically, it's like a splint. In fact, it's called the splinting cycle. Some people in medical science call it the splinting cycle. Like putting, I don't know, a piece of metal or wood up your spine and making sure that you can't move, essentially. And that is absolutely necessary, because if you do something silly while it's healing, then, oh my goodness, it would take probably years eventually for your body to be able to heal that re-injury. In my case, getting into the pyramid because of this splint up my spine, this natural splint, it was really difficult and very painful. In fact, as I now know, of course, when you have a natural splinting cycle in your spine, it's even more painful than the original injury, much more painful. When you have a cramp, if you've probably experienced a cramp at some point in your life, Natalie, whenever your muscles cramp, what happens is that the blood is squeezed out because of the cramping of the muscles, right? So that creates a kind of hypoxic environment. And when hypoxia occurs, then the cramping actually intensifies even more. Do you remember many, many years ago, the Jane Fonda workout? And she used to say, you have to feel the burn, right? Do you remember that? Well, it's a similar sort of way, that's due to slightly different mechanisms, but still what she was referring to is a cramping of the muscles. And she was effectively saying, if you don't cramp your muscles, then you're not going to gain benefit. I don't think that's entirely true. There is a little grain of truth in it. But anyway, suffice to say, I got myself into the pyramid that day in great pain, set up the experiment, which proved to be an amazing experiment, really. I had no idea it was going to be anywhere near as successful as it was. And what I was interested in was the resonant properties of the sarcophagus in the King's Chamber. This is a monolithic block of granite, rose granite, like a lovely pinky color, all the way from Aswan. And the Egyptians had hollowed it out to make a sarcophagus, right? And originally it would have had a lid. No one knows where that lid went in history, but anyway, it certainly doesn't have a lid today. Because it was so wonderfully resonant, that granite box that I had lain in the year before, exactly a year, and I thought, wow, this is an astonishingly resonant piece of granite, a block of granite. And I was really inspired to learn about the properties of that granite and whether or not the Egyptians had contrived to make it so, or whether it was all just happenstance, the way that it happened to work. Anyway, so from an engineering perspective, I was fascinated. And so this experiment that I had designed for 97 was a cymatics experiment, making visible the resonant properties of the sarcophagus. So instead of using standard acoustics instrumentation, which I actually had done the year before in 96, this time I wanted to be able to see the resonances and study them from a cymatics viewpoint. And so, I'm sure that you know, and many people watching and listening will already know that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs began to appear in the sand sprinkled on the membrane. And I mean, who would have thought that? I certainly never dreamed of anything happening like that. I thought I was going to be seeing some geometric patterns, which is typical of cymatics, and I thought, when I get back to the UK, I'll be able to take photographs. Obviously, I'll be able to study these cymatic patterns and learn more about the resonances just by studying the geometry that those resonances had created. But boy, was I proven wrong. And so, of course, in seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, I I was naturally very excited, like who wouldn't be under those circumstances. And so about 20 minutes into this experiment, this wonderful experiment, I suddenly realized that there was no pain in my lower back, completely gone, even though I had been in severe pain for 3 solid weeks, taking, probably way too many analgesics, and then trying to get myself into the pyramid, was so difficult and such pain. And yet, 20 minutes of making sound in the King's Chamber, no pain. So I thought in that moment that my bloodstream will be flowing with endorphins. I'm sure it was. Anybody would be in that kind of excited state. Natural opioids are created when you have a peak experience in your life, whatever that may be. In my case, the peak experience was seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? So then I thought, naturally, my bloodstream is flowing with endorphins. And one of the things about natural opioids is that they are really great for muting pain. This is why synthetic morphine is created, to help people with pain, and it's really successful from that point of view. And that all came out of nature, obviously, originally. We have these natural opioids in our body, created when we have a peak experience. So I thought, well, obviously, when I get back outside the pyramid, back to the hotel, the pain is going to come back with a vengeance. It's bound to, it's got to, surely. But no, the pain never did come back. And so that was a huge turning point in my life. It was such a turning point that when I got back to the UK, I immediately put plans in motion to sell my acoustics business. Right at that time, had been in business, like I said, for almost 30 years. And so it took 2 years to sell the business, because I realized immediately this was a gift from heaven. To be able to experience something like that, Natalie, where suddenly it's almost like a miracle, really. It was definitely miraculous for sure. To be able to go in that pyramid in extreme pain and come out like a whole human being, no pain at all, and then no pain ever came back. So it lit a fire in me to understand the biological mechanisms. At that time, I was not a biologist. I was an engineer, a good engineer, and I had a very large body of knowledge in acoustics, but my biology was pretty basic actually in those days. But that inspiration set me on this path that I'm still on today. And so now, all of these years later, I'm writing texts for medical textbooks. I'm still not really, no biologist would consider me to be a biologist, for example, but nevertheless, I do have a lot of knowledge now in biology, and I'm using it to good effect. I'm helping a lot of people because of my understanding of this broader understanding of being able to see through my acoustics eyes, if you like, all of the properties of sound and light, by the way, because you probably already know from my work that sound gives birth to light. In fact, to such an extent that you cannot have light without sound. Light, literally, in the universe is created by all of the atomic furnaces in the suns of this universe, and they are very noisy places. All of the atomic collisions that are going on inside stars create a cacophony of sound, right? And it's probably just as well that we can't hear it. But astroseismologists that's their job. Their job is to listen in to the sounds inside stars, and then to use that data, that knowledge, to be able to figure out more about the processes that are going on in the star. And their process basically is to take some of the starlight, and just which is collected via a standard telescope basically, and then demodulate the light, because the light has little fluctuations in it that you can't see with the naked eye, but nevertheless they are there. And these fluctuations are literally the sound inside the star, right? So then when you demodulate that light, the information that's literally on the back of the light, you could say, then you can hear the sounds inside the star. And the same process is going on in reverse, meaning that when we make sound on Earth, that sound creates light by the same mechanism, basically. In other words, like now I'm talking, and I'm literally vibrating all of the air molecules and atoms in front of me, right? And I'm creating a bubble of sound, and this bubble is oscillating in and out with the vocal folds, in my larynx. And as that's happening, all of these collisions are happening between the air particles, let's call them. And when that happens, friction is created. That's the common word that we use for, when we rub something together. In this case, it's atoms that are colliding. But every time they collide, because of the magnetic shells that are literally surrounding all of the atoms and molecules, when the atoms and molecules creating now by my voice frequencies, when they collide with each other, they create light. But the light that's created is not visible, of course. It's in the infrared spectrum, right? But that light, nevertheless, is carrying the modulations of my voice frequencies. And this is really wonderful. This is an aspect of physics which is very, well, not usually talked about, right? But it becomes supremely important when we talk about the power of sound therapy and music medicine to affect healing. Why? Because it turns out that all of the cells in our body are communicating with each other primarily in the infrared spectrum. So now you get the picture that when we are immersed in a musical environment or a sound therapy environment, say someone's playing crystal bowls or Tibetan bowls or gongs, we have one of these, we experience one of these gong baths, for example. We are being showered by thousands of sound frequencies for sure, which, we could talk about how they actually support healing in the body. But in addition to the sound frequencies, because of what I've just shared about sound gives birth to light, therefore, we are also in an environment in which we are being showered with infrared light frequencies that are being modulated by those sound frequencies. Now, the infrared, particularly the near infrared spectrum, penetrates very deeply into our tissues, right? And communicates then with the cells, with all of our cells, in the medium of their own language, because the cells are literally sending energy information between each other mainly in the near infrared spectrum. So they are absorbing all of this kind of nutrition, both sonically and in the field of light, in the spectrum of light. So it's a really wonderful subject, Natalie, and I'm sorry that that was a long explanation for your question, but that's the basis of why I'm so passionate today. Because of that healing, it set me on this journey that I'm still on today, and I probably will be on for the rest of my days, because I'm so passionate about being able to help other people to heal in the same way that I healed from severe pain. Now, knowing what I do know about sound therapy and music medicine, it has huge power, far more power actually than pharmacological substances in most cases. I know there are some pharmacological substances that are very important, and I wouldn't deny that, obviously. But in many cases, sound frequencies and light frequencies can actually achieve what pharmacology cannot. And that's a very exciting aspect of my work.
Thank you for sharing all of that. It's really tremendous to hear everything that led you to what you're doing now. And so let's kind of stay with that line you're talking about. You've worked with musicians, sound healing practitioners, and looked at how sound affects biological mechanisms. I wonder if you could give a couple examples of some of the most surprising or profound results you've seen from using sound with your cymoscope, but also as, the application of sound as a therapeutic tool.
I'd be very, very happy to. Excuse me. One of the wonderful discoveries that I made in collaboration with Professor Sungchul Ji of Rutgers University, that, that occurred in 2018, actually. He came to the lab here to work with me to develop a protocol for an experiment that I had dreamed up while lying in bed one day, right? I get some of my great ideas that way. I'm sure that many people do. It's when you're in that twilight zone between waking and sleeping, and your whole consciousness, and now I'm talking about not just the consciousness in your brain, in one's brain, but also the consciousness in every cell of one's body, the subconscious. When you're in that kind of twilight zone, the whole of your being can dream wonderful things. And for me, I get some of these wonderful ideas in that zone. And this one was just dreaming up a really simple experiment to test the power of music in relation to human cells. And I thought, well, what better way than to test blood cells, because they're readily available. We can buy blood from a blood bank. And so anyway, cutting this short, Professor G from Rutgers, because he was an expert biologist, and at that time, I didn't have enough biology to be able to navigate that world. Anyway, he came here, we worked together side by side to develop this protocol using human blood. And essentially, it's really simple. You take a test tube of whole human blood, warm it up first of all, because it comes chilled, it is chilled when we get it from the blood bank. We warm it up to normal blood temperature, and then decant it into two smaller test tubes. One of these test tubes goes into a very quiet environment in our lab here, which is the Faraday cage. It's a cage which basically prevents electromagnetism getting into the cage. So there's no effect at all from electromagnetism on that blood. And also it's a very quiet environment in there. It's been designed to be acoustically quiet. So it's extremely quiet when the door is shut. And in there's an incubator, so we keep the blood at blood temperature, normal blood temperature. And that's the control, right? And then the other little vial of blood goes into another incubator in the main body of the lab here, where we have a small speaker. So now we can play music to that blood. And the protocol that we designed was 20 minutes of immersion in music, right? So the blood would receive music for 20 minutes at a particular sound pressure level. And then we would we do what's called a viability test on the blood from both places. So we would use an automatic cell counter. So it's not like the days when you had to use a microscope and, literally use a special kind of slide to count all of the live cells. And so you don't have to do that anymore, fortunately. It's all done automatically. And so we tested the blood from both places. Well, the really surprising result on the first days that we worked after designing the protocol, and we were now starting to run the experiments, right? The really surprising result was that we were seeing significant increases in the viability of the blood that had been immersed in the music. And that was an exciting thing to see, and we had hoped for it, but we didn't really know whether it would work, but it certainly did. And we were seeing increases like 15%, 18% increase in the viability of the blood cells as opposed to the control. But the really odd thing, and was counterintuitive, was that the best results did not come from the classical music selections that we had chosen, which we thought would provide the best results, but it was coming from the popular music selections, right? And we thought, wow, this is really quite something. It was counterintuitive, as I said, and we had to kind of scratch our heads a bit. And over lunch, we were talking about what could possibly be the difference between the classical music and the popular music. Well, the obvious thing was the bass energy in the popular music. Almost all popular music has this throbbing, pounding bass beat, right? And rhythm, but the classical music does not. In fact, if you look at a spectrum analysis of classical music, in most selections, I mean, we know that there are some selections that have a fairly powerful bass register, but most classical music lacks that bass energy. It's really mainly mid-range and upper frequency, high frequency energy. And so that was a pretty obvious, conclusion to draw over our lunch. And then, so when we came back into the lab, we said, well, how can we prove this, with this hypothesis? Well, one of the ways that we decided to try was to put some blood direct into the cymoscope instrument. And let me just go and get if I can get a cuvette to show you. Actually, I can probably get one here. Yeah, I've got one here. I've got a nice little drawer here full of full of little cuvettes. Let me just see if I can get one to show you. So here's a little cuvette. This is made of fused quartz, and you can see it's got a little screw in, and it's got a black. This is literally black fused quartz on the bottom, right? And so this is the container that we would put the blood into. And the reason that we wanted to put it into the cymoscope instrument, which is an instrument that makes sound visible, that's what it does, and that's the instrument that was developed because of the inspiration of that very successful cymatics experiment in the King's Chamber. So it makes sound visible, but one of the things about it is that it has a really good low frequency response. It can get right down to 3 hertz actually. And whereas the little speaker that we had in the incubator in the lab here, well, that really couldn't get much below 80 hertz. It was a small Sony speaker. And the thing about small speakers is that they can never produce really deep bass sounds, simply because of the physics of the size of the cone and how far the cone can move, and all of that comes into play. So to get really, really deep sounds from speakers, you have to have big speakers, usually. Anyway, so we thought, well, maybe if we put the blood direct into the cymoscope instrument, we would be able to see what the effect is of really low frequencies on the blood. And so that's what we did. And because there'd been I'd read a lot of research about 40 hertz, for example, or 44 hertz, these, very low frequencies in terms of their benefits for example, focal pain relief. In other words, if you put a transducer on your body, wherever you have a pain, right? If you put a focally applied energy into that place, you can mediate the pain immediately because, well, it's a long story. I can go into that later, but you can stop the pain just by using sound. And anyway, so knowing all of this, we thought, well, let's try a low frequency. And the first frequency we tried was 44 hertz. And so we put 44 hertz tone into the cymoscope instrument, and we saw this beautiful pattern emerge on the surface of the blood. And that wasn't a surprise, because sound will always imprint on any liquid, and we only use pure water normally in the cymoscope instrument for various reasons. But in this case, I mean, blood is nearly entirely water, right? So it wasn't a surprise that we would see a beautiful cymatic pattern. But what was a big surprise was when we then stopped that tone, that pure 44 hertz tone, the pattern remained in the blood. Well, this is, at the time we thought this is nuts. Normally with a cymatic pattern, you put sound energy into water, you'll get a beautiful cymatic pattern, say. You take the sound away and the pattern immediately stops. Immediately, it's gone. Because the organizational ability of sound frequencies, when those sound frequencies enter into water, you've got to think of water as being, well, trillions and trillions of randomly moving molecules of water, H2O, and they're just moving about, quite happily gyrating because of the local heat, whatever the temperature is, say, in the room. In this case, it might be, I don't know, 23, 24 degrees C in here. And so they're just moving about, not in any particular place or organization. And they're not organized, in fact, at all. They're entirely random, right? It's like Brownian motion, essentially. It's just movements, random movements. But as soon as sound enters into the picture, all of those molecules, in a blink of an eye, are suddenly beautifully organized, right? I mean, it's gorgeous to behold, especially when you see it live happening in the cymoscope instrument. Whoosh, beauty, immediate beauty, right? But remove the sound, goes back to Brownian motion again, right? This is what we wouldn't have expected. But suddenly with this blood, no, the pattern remained imprinted on the blood. And this was a huge, what was hugely exciting, but it was also a huge clue as to what was going on, because this told us exactly what was going on, which is that the low frequency, in this case 44 hertz, had caused the oxygen that's dissolved in the blood to bind to the hemoglobin molecules, well, pretty much permanently, right? In other words, as soon as you put the frequencies into the blood, the dark red color of the blood, when it comes from the blood bank, it's this really dark maroon color, suddenly goes bright scarlet, right? And this is because the dissolved oxygen, so whoever this person was, that the donor that gave this blood, when that person is respirating, is breathing, of course, those breaths cause the oxygen to go through from the air, through the lungs, through the alveoli, direct into the bloodstream, his bloodstream or her bloodstream. We don't know who it was. And then when that blood is drawn by the phlebotomist and sent to us, it contains huge amounts of oxygen. But because there's no pressure involved, there's no heartbeat, right? It's just blood in a test tube. There's no heartbeat and there's no sound. Therefore, the oxygen is separated, if you could say, from the hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cells. They're not talking to each other, you see. Therefore, the blood is really dark red, very, very dark red. But as soon as low frequency sound comes into the picture, suddenly the pressure from the low frequencies causes that oxygen immediately to bind with the hemoglobin. Result, bright scarlet pattern appears in the blood. Remove the sound, bright scarlet pattern remains in the blood, because the hemoglobin is now saying, thank you very much, I've got my oxygen, thank you, and I'm not letting go of it, right? Now in the body, of course, it's a different scenario, because the oxygen is constantly binding to hemoglobin. Every time there's a heartbeat, boom, 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 that causes the oxygen that's in the blood to bind to the hemoglobin. But at the same time, there are other mechanisms at work to take the oxygen away from the hemoglobin, because it's needed for tissues, right? To power, literally to power your body, for all the healing mechanisms, or almost all the healing mechanisms in your body need oxygen. And your brain is very greedy for oxygen, needs a lot of oxygen. These two different processes going on, one to cause the oxygen to bind, one to cause it to release into the tissues and so on. That's going on constantly in your body all of the time. But here in a test tube environment, it's a bit different because there is no release of the oxygen. Once the oxygen has been bound to the hemoglobin, because it's not being used to repair tissues or whatever in the body, it just holds on to it, right? And so you've got this bright scarlet pattern simply sitting there looking at you, in the blood. It was a wonderful moment, Natalie. Really, it was, again, kind of life changing in many ways because now, all of these years later, we have conducted a whole series of experiments, not only with red blood cells, but also with white blood cells as well. And now we are very close now to publishing all of the results. Well, not all the results, but certainly a specific set of results that will become, I hope, a groundbreaking paper, will change a lot of people's opinions about the way that music affects human beings, particularly music. And this is really exciting because there are millions and, well, probably billions of young people, particularly in the world, who are, buying music all the time, usually downloads these days, of course, and listening to music all the time for a lot of many hours in the day and enjoying it, going around with these earbuds and so on, they're experiencing music a lot, and yet they don't realize, although they're enjoying it, and there are benefits, biological benefits to just having the enjoyment itself is a benefit, but they don't realize the power of music to affect real biological change in their bodies and health giving properties. This is new information, right? So I think this is a really exciting paper that we have written. It's very close now to going off for peer review. And once it's published, I think it could change a lot of people's perceptions about the power of music.
Absolutely. It has a lot of implications. That's going to be very important. Yeah, I'll keep an eye for when that's released. You know, um, we could dive more into the science behind sound and cymatics, but let's do the balance of the left and right brain like you were talking about earlier. I wonder, at least with your time, with your work with cymatics, with sound, what your research suggests about the nature of reality itself, how maybe your findings over time have led you to reconsider viewpoints, perspectives on consciousness, the universe, and the role of vibration in our spiritual existence. Let's head that direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, it's a very wonderful question, a very big question, actually. And I think that, the starting point here is how sound became the prime mover in organization, first of all, in the universe as a whole. So, there are many spiritual traditions that talk about sound in being the creative force, the creative principle of the universe, including the Christian tradition, literally in the Bible, but also many other traditions, such as the Vedic Indian tradition. In the beginning was Brahman, and so on. So, and Vak, I beg your pardon. And these traditions, all from my research, seem to have originated from ancient Egypt, actually, because there's a wonderful stone tablet that was found written for the pharaoh Shabako, and this stone tablet is actually in the British Museum, and it's thought by many Egyptologists to be the most important stone tablet to come out of Egypt, second only to the Rosetta Stone, from which all hieroglyphs were ultimately translated, deciphered rather. Anyway, so this Shabako stone tells of the god Ptah creating the universe from his words, essentially, and it's believed by many historians that that's it, that's the originating script from which biblical and maybe even the Indian uh, Veda texts and so on came from. Who knows? But whatever the truth of that is, the fact is that many spiritual traditions do talk about the power, the creative power of sound. And now it turns out, of course, that they were absolutely correct. Where that information came from is obviously something for us to ponder on, to puzzle on. But still, they have all been proven to be correct. And now it's a mainstream model of cosmology that acoustic baryonic oscillations, as they're called, this fancy term, essentially means sound, the power of sound in the early universe to create order, to create structure. And so now this aspect of cosmology talks about how sound, excuse me, was the prime mover in organizing the early days of the universe. So, and it's actually the period of time that they talk about is the first 370,000 years after the Big Bang. So, in that first 370,000 years, according to the theory, sound was the prime mover, not gravity, not any of the other forces, but sound. And that's why today, looking at the universe through very powerful telescopes, um, astronomers, cosmologists can see groups of galaxies in certain areas of the heavens and groups of galaxies in certain other areas, groups of galaxies I'm talking here, hundreds of galaxies in a group, but separated by enormous voids. And the reason for these structures, one of the papers that talks about this is called the egg carton universe, right? And because you can see the geometric structures essentially, and they derived from sound, right? So then coming fast forward, 13.7 billion years or whatever to Earth, actually it would be more like 10 billion, I guess, because then we're talking about the early days of Earth and the primordial oceans on Earth. One of the interesting new theories concerning how the Earth got its oceans is, for a long time we've been reading about cometary impacts bringing water to Earth and so on. These days, it's the kind of more mainstream theory is that the water was already there, not literally as liquid water, but in the rocks themselves that were formed, of course, from other um, matter in the universe. Ultimately, when the sun was formed from a cloud of gas and it eventually uh, threw off matter, which eventually aggregated and caused planets to form and so on, that in that matter, water was already present. And of course, water is, at any kind of temperature above 100 degrees C is vapor, right? It's not liquid anymore. It's just vapor. It's just gas. But as soon as the Earth cooled sufficiently, of course, then literally the liquid water would start to would pop out from the gas and become literally the oceans ultimately. But anyway, so now we have an Earth and we have oceans, but we don't have life yet, right? So what caused the life to manifest? And that's a big question in biology, and nobody can give you an answer to that. Not any definitive answer. What biologists would tell you is that, well, the Earth was almost certainly seeded from space by meteoric and cometary impacts, and those meteoric and cometary impacts brought with them the building blocks of life. Now, where that hypothesis came from, or literally a theory really, is mainly because of the work of Fred Hoyle, Sir Fred Hoyle, who wrote a wonderful book called Life Cloud. And in this book, it's a really great read. Anybody interested should really if you're interested in abiogenesis, how life was created, then I highly recommend Life Cloud. He also wrote a novel, by the way, about the same subject, which is also great. But this other book is a non-fiction book. Anyway, Life Cloud talks about spectrographic analysis of energies coming from space to Earth, where they were able to pick out, Fred and his co-workers, able to pick out the signatures of simple sugars, for example, and amino acids and so on, all just by spectrographic looking at the energy coming from these clouds in space. And also there are types of meteoric impact called carbonaceous chondrites, which are very small meteorites, but when analyzed on Earth in laboratories, sure enough, they find these, life-giving prebiotic compounds. And so there was a lot of evidence already kind of mounting up to support this idea that the Earth's waters, the oceans, had been seeded from space. But then there's been two major scientific missions that have absolutely proven it now. And how they did that was the European Space Agency a few years ago sent an audacious mission to Comet 67P, very mundane name for this comet, but anyway, 67P, and literally landed on the comet. This comet is traveling at like 10,000 miles an hour, right? I mean, it's so audacious to even think about, but they succeeded. They had two spacecraft. One was called the Rosetta spacecraft, like, from the Rosetta Stone. And then the other little kind of spacecraft that came away from the mother craft was called the Philae lander, after the Philae temple in Egypt. And this Philae lander literally landed on the comet, and it had a device on it, an instrument called a mass spectrometer, which literally sensed the dust on the comet and was able to analyze it and send the data back to Earth, back to European Space Agency, where they analyzed it and found, lo and behold, lots of organic compounds, literally organic compounds on the surface of this comet, traveling at 10,000 miles an hour, give or take, right? I mean, it's just astonishing. And then much more recently, there was another landing on a comet, a mission called OSIRIS-REx. This is a NASA mission, and found the same thing, organic compounds. So this is now proven, right, that organic compounds are created in space, in the vacuum of space. I don't know whether the mechanism is really fully understood yet, but however these organic compounds are created, they are being created, and obviously there have been periods in Earth's history, particularly a few billion years ago, where the Earth went through huge showers of meteoric and cometary impacts. And therefore you can understand now how the Earth was seeded, the oceans of the Earth were seeded with all of this biological material. So now you've got the picture that we have the oceans, we have the building blocks of life, but they're all just a bit like I was explaining earlier about the random Brownian motions of water molecules. You can now visualize, I think, easily all of these building blocks just randomly jostling around, right? How are they ever going to create life, right? The permutations of them ever coming together and literally creating life are so mind-boggling. The statistical probability of that happening is just crazy. You can't even imagine. There's no way to even predict how it would take probably more than the age of the universe, right, to have any kind of collisions that would ultimately create life, right? So what's the answer? Well, my answer, my hypothesis is that sound was the organizing principle. And one of the things, one of the ways that I kind of describe this in presentations that I have given is to think about a mechanical watch. You know, I'm wearing a mechanical watch here. It has a few hundred, maybe 300, 400 moving parts. If I took that watch and disassembled it, all of the little cogs and wheels and springs and so on, and put them into a flask, into a one of glass flask from the lab here, and put it on a mechanical shaker and shake it up, how long would it take for all of those parts to suddenly become a working mechanical watch again, right? Well, the answer to that is pretty obvious, that never. And one of the reasons, obviously, is because the friction between all the parts would eventually cause the parts to fall apart, right? They would never, ever be able to come together. But even if we discounted that, even if we said, okay, this is a miraculous kind of watch, a miraculous parts where we can forget the frictional components of this thought experiment, forget that's going to wear out the parts. Just say, okay, there's no friction. Now what? Now how long is it going to take? Well, again, the answer is never. It just wouldn't. There's no way. And so now if you then translate that into the biological environment in the water, these prebiotic compounds, again, without an organizing principle, they would never ever come together. And so in my model, it's sound. Sound is the organizing principle. So how does that work? Well, the model that I hypothesize concerns hydrothermal vents, because in mainstream biology, I think there's very little doubt. I mean, most biologists would agree that the most likely environment for life to emerge is around hydrothermal vents. That's simply because of the warmth of the gases are coming up out of the earth that are very warm or even hot. And also they are creating bubbles, right? They're creating sound. So more than likely, and if you look at hydrothermal vents today, you always will find growths around them, literally lichens and various kinds of simple vegetable organisms around these hydrothermal vents. So that's the kind of, mainstream view that life almost certain. But again, they don't talk about mechanisms, right? We don't know about that. In my view, it's because of sound. So let me explain how. And cymatics is a really important part of this model. There's something called Helmholtz resonance. Hermann Helmholtz was a wonderful German scientist, physicist, and this term, Helmholtz resonance, refers to the natural property of a volume of gas, an enclosed volume of gas, to have a natural resonant frequency. These sometimes are called eigentones, sometimes it's called a natural resonant frequency, but basically any enclosed volume of gas will have a natural resonant frequency at which it will naturally resonate with. If you have a sound environment, a noisy environment, for example, in this case, this jostling of all the bubbles that are coming up out of the hydrothermal vent will create a kind of noise. This noise is a mixture of thousands of frequencies caused by the jostling of all these bubbles, right? But every bubble, whatever size it is, it could be microscopic or it could be the size of a melon, every bubble will automatically select the frequency from this melee of cacophony of noise, will automatically select its resonant frequency from that noise. And when that happens, a kind of magic occurs in terms of cymatics, because on the surface of the bubble will appear a cymatic pattern. And I've actually conducted experiments in the lab here to show this effect, right? They're invisible to the unaided eye. You wouldn't know they were there. But if you illuminate the situation in a specific way, you can see the patterns on the surface of the bubble. Well, one of the things about cymatic patterns, of course, is that they have areas that are called nodes and areas that are called antinodes. The nodal areas of a cymatic pattern are the areas of stillness. And the antinodes are obviously the areas, the opposite. They are areas of the high vibration, if you like. And that's what ultimately forms the pattern, this interplay between the nodes and the antinodes. Now you can see, because the pattern is wrapped around the bubble, and I'm talking about microscopic bubbles, so small you would really struggle to see them with the naked eye, right? But these microscopic bubbles, nevertheless, have beautiful cymatic patterns wrapped around them. And in the nodal areas of these bubbles, these patterns, are areas of stillness where these prebiotic compounds can find safe haven. There's no vibration in those areas. So they are literally areas where the compounds that are in the water, literally in that water, can literally find a home where there's no vibration. And because the patterns on these on the surface of these microscopic bubbles are beautiful, that they're harmonious, they look beautiful, right? Therefore, all of these interconnecting parts can bring together these prebiotic compounds in very specific ways. Now, it would still take, even with this organizational principle, it would still take a very long time of trial and error, trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. But eventually, right, the right combinations of prebiotic compounds come together and spark an early form of life in what's termed the membrane of the cell. And many people, many biologists today talk about the membrane being literally the brain of the cell. In other words, not the DNA inside the cell or any of the other mitochondrial aspects, or no, it's the actual membrane itself, which is the powerhouse of the cell. If you look at the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, for example, you'll know what I'm referring to here. So that's a very, very short version of how life perhaps came into being on planet Earth because of cymatic principles. But cymatics can teach us so much. I was very fortunate to be invited to give a presentation at last year's water conference. It was in October, actually, in Lisbon, in Portugal. And it was a packed audience of scientists, and I gave a presentation on my 4 postulated laws of cymatics. I say postulated because they've obviously yet to be proven by other scientists. But one of the wonderful things about these laws, Natalie, is that they point us in the direction of how sound plays out in our bodies, in our biology. There's many aspects to these laws that show us the way. And one of the ways, coming a long way round to answer your question, about the spiritual aspects of sound, concerns the pineal gland, which many people believe have talked about. Even the ancient Egyptians knew about it. It's really hard to understand how they could know about it, but there's lots of evidence that suggests that they did know about it. But it was René Descartes, I think, who said that the pineal gland is the seat of the soul. And of course, many people have said that the eyes are the windows of the soul, right? And it turns out from the second law of cymatics that we can stimulate the pineal gland really beautifully and optimally through our eyes with sound. And how this works, I'll describe very briefly the mechanism in a moment or two, but I think it's pretty common knowledge now, fairly common knowledge, that the pineal gland is the gland that allows us to connect with divine energies. And so by stimulating the pineal gland optimally, then almost certainly we're going to open our connection to the divine. However you think about that in terms of spirituality or religion is not a subject that we should really discuss, because everybody has their own views on that. But where I like to, where I like to go here is simply to show how our glands can be stimulated by sound frequencies, and in particular, in this case, the pineal gland, which, like I say, many people believe is our connection to the divine. So how the second law plays out is really interesting, because what it's showing essentially is that when sound frequencies enter into our bodies, or in this case into our eyes, that all of the so-called wavelengths, I use that say so-called because really there are no sound waves, they're all bubbles, but basically nevertheless we are stuck with this term wavelength. But when all of the sound wavelengths enter into our body, or in this case into our eyes, they are automatically compressed by a ratio of 829 to 1. And where that ratio derives is simply because of the density of air versus the density of water. It's as simple as that. So if you think of air particles, all the different gases that comprise the air, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the CO2, and so on. If you were able to see all of those particles in the air, in the gas that we call air, you would see that the atoms and the molecules are actually quite far apart. They're not close together. They're really quite rare, really. They're floating about, but they're all separated. They're not really close together at all. And so they have a certain density. But now if you look at the density of water and compare that with the density of air, the difference is 829 times. What that means is that when sound passes through air, it obviously propagates at a certain speed, say 760 miles an hour, give or take, right? Depending on where you are at sea level, or, depending on temperature and so on. But say roughly that kind of speed. But the reason for that speed of transmission, the propagation of sound in air, is simply because of the density, the lack of density. If you increase the density, then of course the molecules are much closer together. So the vibrational information is passed on from atom to atom or molecule to molecule far more efficiently, right? And it turns out that this ratio, like I say, is 829 to 1. Well, why is all of that important? Well, it's important because all of the sound frequencies that enter your body are all compressed automatically and instantly by that ratio. And where this is important in relation to the pineal gland, is because the pineal gland, like any other gland in the body, has very specific dimensions. And so, again, coming to this word wavelength, which, I don't like, but I'm stuck with it. If we then compare literally the dimensions of the pineal gland with, say, musical frequencies, and we take into consideration this second law of cymatics and the 829 to 1 ratio, then we very quickly figure out that to optimally stimulate our pineal gland, we need the frequency of E3 on the piano, the third E on the piano. Now, that's not to say that the pineal gland in every single person is exactly the same dimensions. Of course it won't be. People's skulls are slightly different sizes. Are you male? Are you female? What's the size of your head? What's the size of your brain? So there will be little differences between your pineal gland dimensions and mine, for example. But these little differences are quite small, and they're quite easily understood from the point of view of musical frequencies. If you take E3 on a piano, right, for those of you who are not familiar with the principles, most of the piano strings are in sets of three, but even those that are single strings, and they're the very low strings on a piano, are single. But even there, when you play a piano note, whichever note you play, you can tell immediately, even if you've got your eyes shut and somebody plays a piano string for you, literally plays a piano note, you know immediately that's a piano. It's not, it's not a violin, it's not a cello, it's a piano. And anyone will tell you that. And why? Because the harmonics of a piano are very, very specific, right? It's the sound of all those harmonics. In other words, not just the center frequency of the E3 note, and it will have a center frequency, of course, about 165 hertz or something in that area, but it's all the harmonics either side of that center frequency. So now you get the idea that it doesn't matter that your pineal gland is just slightly smaller or slightly larger than mine. It's irrelevant. If you play that E3 note, you're going to be bathed in a whole range of frequencies centered on that 165 hertz, say, right? So in other words, it encompasses a range of different sizes of pineal gland. So the other interesting aspect to all of this is that the eyes are, because they are literally filled with water, or what's almost pure water. It's not actually water, but it's very, very like water. It's very pure, almost pure water. That they transmit sound frequencies with huge efficiency. So, this is kind of new thinking, that when we are immersed in music, that it's not just our body that's soaking up these sound frequencies. Our eyes do it beautifully. And even if you close your eyes, actually, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Your eyelids are quite, well, they're nearly all water. The skin of your eyelids are virtually all water anyway. But okay, keep them open ideally, because then there's even greater efficiency at work. And all those frequencies of music, whether you're using E3 on the piano or not, your eyes are literally soaking up all of those frequencies. And then when you know that your retina is almost pure water, I mean, it's a kind of liquid crystal, and so are the optic nerves. They're liquid crystals, very high percentage of water. And then finally, they reach the pineal gland, that is also bathed in a beautiful little sac of water. So it's water, water, water all the way through. And so the sound from your musical experience, whatever it is, whether it's a piano, Tibetan bowls, gongs, crystal bowls, it doesn't matter. All those frequencies are going to go straight through your eyes and reach your pineal gland. And if everyone's right about the pineal gland and its ability to connect us with divine energies, well, my goodness, there's no better way to do it than with music, because music lifts us in so many different wonderful ways, and helps our biology in a myriad of ways, which we could talk about.
This podcast is sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa, located in Sarasota, Florida, or online at theomshop.com. The Om Shop has North America's largest showroom of vibrational tools, custom instruments, and if you're looking to uplevel your sound healing vibrational tools, they are the place for you. They're very helpful if you're looking for something specific as well. And if you're able to make it there in person, they have a luxury spa too. So thank you to the Om Shop for their support and sponsorship. Yeah, cymatics just shows us so much. And I'm wondering, can you talk about the potential applications of these principles, right? Harmonics and even the potential of harmonic frequencies in nature. So these principles in the music that we listen to, do you believe musicians can use these patterns maybe consciously to enhance health and wellness, right? How can we apply what we understand from the science of cymatics to what we create as musicians or sound healing practitioners?
Great question, Natalie. Well, one of the ways is with the cymoscope instrument, right? I know this is not meant to be a platform for, promoting a product really, and I really kind of dislike that aspect of any kind of podcast where somebody's promoting something, because really, my role here in this podcast or this discussion today is to share information. But you just asked me a question that has direct relevance to the cymoscope instrument. So let me just get a cymoscope to show you. So here we have a cymoscope instrument. This is a new model. It's fully portable. It has a battery compartment underneath. You can see a little control panel. It has a little built-in camera, basically. So it literally, you can take that anywhere. And a musician, I'll just pop it here. A musician can take that into a live music situation and literally make music visible in real time. It uses water as the imprinting medium. But what I want to share with you is not, I suppose it is related, very much related to the cymoscope instrument, but your question is more about, I think, more about cymatics in general and how, in the relationship with music, how it can help us and perhaps from the healing perspective. One of the interesting aspects comes back to this idea of sound, or physics principle really, of sound giving birth to light. And with the cymoscope instrument and with cymatics in general, the sounds that we are creating in water, say, we only use pure water with the cymoscope. We don't use any other fluids. I experimented with many different fluids a long time ago and found that the purer the water, the better. So we use triple distilled medical grade water. This is the kind of water that you could inject into your veins, without any problem at all, because it's pure. It's got no solutes at all in it. Anyway, so we use this medical grade water. When sound, or in this case we're talking about music, really, musical frequencies enter into that water, as we've discussed, it creates great beauty within the blink of an eye, very short fraction of a second. You've got all that beautiful organization. And what happens is, particularly with the cymoscope instrument, because it's a calibrated instrument, that is to say that the patterns that are being created are accurate analogs, accurate models of the originating, in this case, music, right? So they're literally a kind of way of converting musical frequencies to a geometry, to a form of geometry, which, if you had sufficient powerful mathematics, you'd be able to reverse engineer from the geometry back to the original frequencies. It cannot be achieved yet. The mathematics hasn't been developed, but theoretically, you should be able to take the geometry, you should be able to analyze the geometry and go back to the originating sounds that created that geometry, right? Well, why am I discussing all of this? Well, it's because when we create cymatic patterns with the cymoscope instrument, or even people that are working at home experimentally with cymatics, they don't have a cymoscope instrument, but nevertheless, they're able to create cymatic patterns. They may not be as accurate, let's say, as the cymoscope in terms of the geometries that are being created, but nevertheless, they can create some beautiful patterns. Those patterns are containing models, geometric models of the originating sounds. Now, given the fact that the sounds themselves have healing properties, all of music has healing properties, and we haven't talked about really we haven't hardly touched upon all of the biological mechanisms that are at work when we are immersed in a musical environment. But there are many biological mechanisms that are immediately affected by the musical frequencies. But nevertheless, when we make those healing frequencies visible as cymatic or cymaglyphs, as we call them, just another word for sound image, that image in itself now contains healing potential. How? Why? Well, because it is a model of the sound in geometric terms, when, let's say you have light that's being used to project this pattern. If you use a video projector, in other words, and you're projecting the output of the cymoscope onto a wall, say, or a screen, then a percentage of that light is in the infrared spectrum. So now I think you know where I'm going with this, that the light that's coming off that projection of geometry, and it can be real time, it can be dynamic, right? So not a static image, in fact, it could be a dynamic moving image. The light that's coming off it, some of that light is in the near infrared spectrum, and that is being modulated by the geometries. So the light is not just static light, it's carrying information, and it's carrying the information, in this case, in the near infrared spectrum, that's then deeply penetrating into your tissues. And we talked earlier about how all of your cells are communicating primarily in the near infrared spectrum. So just the act of looking at cymatic imagery, or being in the area where this cymatic imagery is being projected, is actually an act of healing in itself. And the same is also true even of a print. If we take a cymatic pattern, a cymaglyph from the cymoscope instrument, let's say, take our voice, one of the services that we offer, this is a little plug, DNA, we actually make a DNA voice signature. So you can send in your voice, we will make it visible with the cymoscope instrument. This helps our research because every time we do this for somebody, we get a little bit of money that just helps to support our research. So, I think I feel okay me mentioning that. The fact is, though, when you receive your DNA voice signature, it is a still moment, but nevertheless, it contains in that moment a model of your voice frequencies made visible. And then you have that digital file printed out at a print shop somewhere, and you put it on your wall. And it might not be your voice, it might be the voice of a loved one, whomever it is. You put it on the wall in your home or in your office, and now sunlight or incandescent light illuminates that still pattern, and that still sunlight or still incandescent light now becomes modulated by the pattern, by the geometry in that pattern. So now you get the idea that these vibrations are, again, in the infrared spectrum particularly, are going to deeply penetrate your own body and anyone else's that's in that vicinity, carrying with it the energy information from that pattern. And so this is a long-winded way to say that cymatic patterns hold the power of healing. And one of the wonderful Indian traditions is called drishti, which basically means open-eyed meditation. So now, you can visualize a situation where you can literally meditate with your eyes open on a cymaglyph or on a DNA voice signature, and literally receive these healing vibrations deep into your tissues and into your pineal gland in the way that I've described, and deeply healing. So I hope that helps to describe what you're
That's
referring to.
amazing. That's really interesting that you said that. I actually have meditated with a mandala before, and even hours later, I could still see it. So that's really interesting that you say that. There's a bit of an
Amazing.
imprint there. Well, I think I have a feeling that we could do a part two and a part three sometime. It's just so fascinating, all that this reveals and implicates, as well as everything that led you to this journey. I think it's just limitless. The collaborations you could possibly have as well. So thank you for your inspiring work. Thank you for your time. And I hope to connect with you again sometime soon. Thanks,
It's a
John.
great pleasure, Natalie. You're doing a really great job helping me in this case to, spread my work into the world. And I know you're doing it for many other people. So I'm really grateful to you for inviting me onto your podcast, and I'd be very happy to come back anytime and talk more on any of these subjects that I'm so passionate about, and I love to share on. And because uh, helping humanity is a great honor, a great privilege, and I love to help people in any way that I can. So thank you so much for your time today, Natalie.
Thank you. Thanks so much, John.
Many blessings. Bye bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Sounds Heal Podcast, sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. You can keep up to date with what's coming up next at soundshealstudio.com, on Instagram, Natalie Brown Sounds Heal, on Facebook, Sounds Heal Studio, and listen to meditations, music, and podcasts on the YouTube channel, Sounds Heal Studio. Thanks again for listening and for your support. Be well and stay tuned.